Hi there, I'm Lori. If you struggle with conflict in your neurodiverse relationship, you are most definitely not alone. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in mixed neurotype relationships, and I'm here today to talk to you about a framework called the Four Horsemen. And we're going to talk about how these horsemen relate to conflict in neurodiverse relationships. Now, this framework was developed by a renowned relationship researcher named John Gottman. You may have heard of him. And it's important to state he did not do this research specifically on neurodiverse couples, but I'm assuming there were some that were in the mix, and certainly from what I witness as a couples therapist, I've seen plenty of ways this framework is helpful for neurodiverse couples and can apply to your relationship as well. So what he found in his research is that there's basically four kind of categories of behavior that are particularly harmful to relationships. And when these four categories of behavior are present, or really any one of them is present to a large degree, it's a lot more likely that a couple is going to experience relationship dissatisfaction, and that relationship may not even last. Like, this is a main way that they were able to predict what was going to happen in the future of a couple's relationship, was to what extent they saw couples engage in these four behaviors during the course of a conflict. So we're going to look at each one of these really briefly. If you want to better understand what each of these horsemen is and what it looks like, I'm going to provide a link for you for a resource where you can learn some more about them. But I'm mostly going to describe them super briefly and then really focus on like why, how does this connect with neurodiversity. So the first horseman is criticism. And criticism is any form of like bringing up a concern or a complaint or a need in the relationship that takes the form of really focusing on your partner and making a statement about what your partner has done wrong, as opposed to being able to name something from a place of like what you need or what you're hoping for, or even just stating your disappointment or frustration in a way that's got less of a bite or less of a sting for your partner on the receiving end. And there's a few reasons why I think criticism can happen more frequently in neurodiverse relationships. Really, the main one is about expectations. When you've got two different brains in the relationship, it's really easy to have completely different sets of needs, wants, hopes, preferences that have everything to do with how you process the world and how you experience relationships. And when you haven't done the work to get really explicit and clear with each other about what you need and what you expect from one another, and also really done the work to be explicit and clear with each other about like, this is what I can do, but like, this is what I can't do. This is just too hard for my brain. When you haven't really done this work that all couples should do, but neurodiverse couples really have to do it, or there's just so much that's working against them, you're going to have these mismatched expectations. And that's going to lead to you viewing the things your partner is doing in a more negative light, which is going to make you more likely to criticize them. I think a lot of times these expectations, when they're inappropriate or when they're not realistic, they can lead us to tell stories about our partner that are really unfair to them. And so it might sound like, oh, my partner doesn't really care about me. If they did care about me, they would have done XYZ, or they wouldn't do XYZ, or they must not respect me because they did this, or they didn't do that, or they must not listen to me, right? So there's kind of all these stories that we might tell ourselves, and this can go both directions, neurodivergent to neurotypical, neurotypical to neurodivergent, that really kind of create this meaning out of a behavior that leads us to feel like we've been mistreated in some way in the relationship. And so when we're operating from that kind of a narrative, we're more likely to bring a concern up in a way that's got a little bit of like bite to it and some intensity to it. Another reason why there can be criticism in a neurodiverse relationship is because there are differences in terms of processing that can lead one partner to be just a lot more aware of things that go on that they don't like or that aren't ideal than maybe happening for the other partner. I've seen it's just more common for there to be some mismatch here, right? In terms of the balance of who's noticing what flaws or what mistakes and who's kind of less likely to notice that. So if you're a person who's noticing more that's not quite right in the relationship, that doesn't necessarily mean you're being more critical, although it could mean that for sure. But it can happen that when one person's got kind of a high volume of things where they're giving feedback to the partner about like, change this or do that, or this didn't quite go right for me, the other partner can start to feel pretty worn down by that over time. And then when they do have something that comes to their awareness in terms of, oh, here's something that I wanted or needed that I didn't get, and I've already absorbed so much from them about what they want and need that sometimes then that concern comes out with kind of a force behind it, almost like a sledgehammer, or Gottman uses this term kind of kitchen sinking of just like, here's all this different stuff now that I'm going to say about the relationship. So those are just a couple ways that neurodiversity can impact this criticism aspect. Let's move on to defensiveness, the second horseman. Defensiveness is a response to your partner's feedback. So criticism and defensiveness often go hand in hand. If somebody brings feedback to us in a critical way, we're going to engage defensively. And vice versa. If we often respond from a place of defensiveness, we're more likely to get criticism when we get feedback because, some other people have learned about us. If I don't really just like slice through that shield of defensiveness, I'm not going to get in there. So just be aware that, if one of you is more critical, one of you is more defensive, that those two behaviors really do tend to link up and reinforce each other. So when we think about defensiveness and neurodiversity, I think one of the most important pieces that we need to highlight is this concept of rejection sensitivity, or it's also sometimes called rejection sensitive dysphoria. And that can be a trait that many neurodivergent people experience. I could honestly do a whole video on this, but the basic premise of it is that for many neurodivergent people, feedback that feels like rejection, or that feels like some expression of like disappointment or frustration, that they're more likely to be really overwhelmed by feedback that's at all critical or brings up any kind of mistake or misstep. And the internal experience of that can be so intense for neurodivergent people. It can really overwhelm them and dysregulate them in some pretty intense ways. And so when that happens internally, often what a partner might see on the outside is, defensiveness, or kind of pushing away at feedback that's brought up. So this is a concept I think that's really important for both partners to try to understand and to try to come up with some ways of better working together around that sensitivity. In addition, burnout, I think, is really common in neurodiverse relationships. And this can be either partner. You've got a lot of differences that you're navigating together on a regular basis. And so usually, even when everything in the relationship is going as well as it possibly can, both partners have this sense of like, oh, I'm stretching a bit. And that's, part of the joy, part of the fun here is that we get to, keep stretching and growing and expanding in terms of who we are and who we can be. But that's also tiring, right? That takes a lot of energy on a regular basis to keep doing that stretch toward a partner. And so when we're already kind of teetering on the edge of exhaustion in the relationship, and we might also be exhausted from other stressors in our life too, but just for now, I'm going to just stick with, if we're kind of teetering on that edge of exhaustion just in the relationship because of the work we keep doing to bridge our differences, like that can also make us a little bit more likely to be defensive, because here comes a piece of feedback and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm already doing so much for you, for our relationship. I can't take in, kind of one more thing or one more request. So that's a little bit about defensiveness and how it connects to neurodiversity. Now let's move on to contempt. Contempt is particularly nasty behavior. This tends to be expressions and even body language that communicates a level of disgust with your partner. Like, this isn't just I'm frustrated with you or I want something desperately from you. This is like, you are awful and you're just, I can hardly stand to even be around you. And so this shows up in neurodiverse relationships, I think, for a few different reasons. The first one really is dysregulation. I think a lot of times dysregulation and finding ways to work together when one or both of you gets dysregulated, that's just so much harder when you've got two different neurotypes in the mix. And I've got a video on zones of regulation that can be a good place to learn a little bit more about that. But just know that emotion regulation is trickier, and kind of overcoming dysregulation together is trickier when you've got different neurotypes in your relationship. So when you're more dysregulated, you're more likely to kind of bring out the most hurtful behaviors toward your partner, which look like contempt. Another reason why contempt can happen is just because you are so different. And again, like we said, when we were talking about defensiveness, like, you're stretching a lot and there's a lot about your partner that you have to kind of suspend judgment about or live with, that may be really kind of hard for you to fully understand or fully empathize with. So when folks are in a place of contempt in a mixed neurotype relationship, they can often hurl things at one another that are actually really about those neurological differences. So it could look like, you're lazy could be hurled at someone who struggles deeply with executive functioning, or you're too emotional, could be leveled at somebody for whom, like, their emotional awareness is just a really core part of how their brain works, right? So it's really important to be aware that when contempt is in your relationship, it could really be attacking these core differences that you have, and that's especially hurtful and especially harmful. So if you recognize that that's something that you're prone to, something that you're doing, if you get nothing else out of this video, please take a moment to stop and really kind of take stock of that. And you can have some compassion for yourself. It's probably coming from a place of a lot of frustration and challenge in the relationship, but at the same time, like, it's really the most hurtful thing that you could be doing to your partner, and that's hurting the relationship, and it's really ultimately hurting you too. Finally, I think another reason why contempt can be more common in mixed neurotype relationships is because I think a lot of times folks in these relationships have abuse histories, and it could be abuse within your family of origin, the family you grew up in. It could be abuse in another relationship before you found each other. And we don't have research to really know for sure if it just is more common, or if the neurodiverse couples that present for therapy are more likely to have had abuse in their backgrounds. But just want to name it, it is really a common thing that I've seen. And if you've been the victim of abuse, especially early in your life, but really at any point in your life, it's quite possible that you've had to learn some particularly aggressive ways of fighting back to protect yourself. Or it could also just be you've had modeled this really nasty behavior, and it's easy to engage in that just because it's kind of part of it's in you, right? This kind of language and this way of treating other people is in you. So if you've had some abuse in your life, again, here's a good place to have some compassion for yourself and to recognize that that set you up for some of this behavior, and also to think about, okay, now what do I need to heal from that, so that I don't bring that same kind of treatment or a version of that treatment to my partner in our relationship. So that is contempt. Last but not least, let's look at stonewalling. Stonewalling is stopping engagement with your partner. So we sometimes refer to this as the silent treatment. It's really anytime somebody's just kind of gone blank, or somebody's really withdrawn and kind of disengaged from either an interaction in and of itself, or just kind of from the relationship altogether. And so here too, stonewalling is really highly correlated with dysregulation. Gottman's done some research on this. Some of us, when we're dysregulated, we go outward and we start, just being really aggressive. But other times when we're dysregulated, our tendency might be to go inward and to just really kind of withdraw. I often think about a turtle going into its shell, right? We feel unsafe, and so we're like, whoop, just gotta kind of disappear and hunker down and keep myself safe. So for folks who have an autistic neurotype, I think it's important to say that often folks are with an autistic neurotype are more prone to behaviors that may look like stonewalling or may kind of fit the description of stonewalling. And again, it is coming from dysregulation, right? Just like John Gottman's research indicates. But there's this extra layer, which is really about how difficult it can be to verbalize things, especially kind of verbalize things about your internal experience. And that can kind of further contribute to stonewalling. There's also something referred to as autistic shutdown, which is really just like a sense of being both overwhelmed and completely under-resourced. And I think there's also ways that that can kind of look like stonewalling or be similar to stonewalling. And again, like I said, it really is coming from a similar place. It just has a particular flavor to it, and it might be even harder for somebody to not engage in this behavior just because of how their brain works. So it's really important to say that, if this is true for you, if stonewalling is something that you do regularly and you're autistic, you might not be able to not do this, right? And that doesn't need to reflect poorly on you, but it is something that you and your partner need to be able to have some proactive conversations around, like, what can you do about that together as a team when that happens. I think another piece that looks like stonewalling, but it actually is different from stonewalling in neurodiverse relationships, is when you have partners with different processing speeds. So somebody might be kind of processing a conflict really quickly, and they're sort of like rapid fire response, responding to it or putting more words out there within the conflict. And you might have another person whose processing speed is much slower, and they are really just kind of struggling to keep up with this faster processing speed. And I would say too, I think it's common that you might already have some differences, but those differences get like heightened over the course of conflict. I've seen that happen quite a bit. So when someone's struggling to keep up, it can look like they're ignoring you or they're shutting you out in some way, but they're not. They just can't keep up. They just need you to slow down. So this is, again, another place where you may find that this behavior is really impacting how your conflict develops and how you respond to conflict over time. And there may be some need for some more creative solutions there. Okay, well, that brings us through our four horsemen: criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. And hopefully this gives you a picture of how each of these can connect with things that are just inherent to neurodiverse relationships, or maybe even inherent to your neurotype. And so I hope this helps you both feel a little bit more oriented to the conflicts that happen and what makes them challenging, and what might be some of the neurological pieces that connect with that. And also, maybe it can help you have a little bit of compassion for yourself, right? And to see, okay, there's behaviors that I engage in that I know hurt my partner and that I absolutely want to change. But there are some reasons why this is really challenging for me to do differently. So there you have it. There's the Four Horsemen and how they connect with neurodiverse relationships.